The War Council fell silent as 23-year-old Rebecca Martinez stepped into the tent. General Harrison's weathered face twisted into barely concealed contempt as he looked her up and down. "This is what they're sending us? A child playing dress-up in daddy's uniform?" The other commanders erupted in laughter. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Within 48 hours, she would be simultaneously commanding 3 separate armies across a 200-mile front, orchestrating the most complex military operation in modern warfare. But first, she had to survive this meeting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Martinez had graduated top of her class from West Point 3 years earlier, but that achievement meant nothing to the grizzled veterans gathered around the strategic map of the Cascade Valley. The region had become a powder keg after the collapse of the Northern Trade Alliance, with 3 distinct military factions vying for control of the vital mountain passes that connected the eastern plains to the western coastal cities. General Harrison, a man whose military career spanned 4 decades, barely glanced at the intelligence reports Rebecca had compiled during her 6 months of reconnaissance in the valley. "Little lady, war isn't fought with spreadsheets and computer models," he drawled, his thick Texas accent dripping with condescension. "It's fought with blood, sweat, and the kind of experience you get from watching your friends die beside you." Colonel Jennifer Walsh, the only other woman in the tent, remained conspicuously silent. She had clawed her way up the ranks over 20 years, earning respect through conformity rather than innovation. Rebecca's rapid promotion threatened the delicate balance Walsh had worked so hard to maintain, and her silence spoke volumes. The situation in Cascade Valley was deteriorating rapidly. The Ironhawks controlled the northern passes, a disciplined force of former Special Operations soldiers led by the ruthless commander Victor Petrov. To the south, the Crimson Brigade had fortified themselves in the mining towns, their guerrilla tactics making them nearly impossible to dislodge. Between them, controlling the Central Valley floor, sat the largest faction, the Coalition of Free States, a loose confederation of militias united only by their hatred of federal authority. Traditional military doctrine called for a single concentrated assault against the weakest faction, followed by a systematic campaign to eliminate the others. But Rebecca had spent months studying the terrain, the supply lines, and most importantly, the psychological profiles of each faction's leadership. She knew that conventional tactics would result in a bloody stalemate that could last years. "The Ironhawks expect us to hit them first," Rebecca explained, spreading her own tactical maps across the table. "They've positioned their heaviest artillery to cover the northern approach routes. The coalition thinks we'll try to divide and conquer, picking off their smaller militia groups one by one. The Crimson Brigade is betting we'll attempt to starve them out of the mining complexes." General Harrison's aide, Captain Douglas Freeman, snorted with derision. "And I suppose our little tactical genius has a better idea." Freeman had been passed over for promotion twice, watching younger officers advance while he remained stuck in administrative roles. The sight of Rebecca's lieutenant colonel insignia at her age made his stomach turn with resentment. Rebecca ignored the interruption. "All 3 factions are wrong because they're thinking like generals. They're preparing for the war they know how to fight, not the war we're actually going to bring them." She traced her finger across the map, indicating 3 separate positions. "We don't attack their strengths. We don't even attack their weaknesses. We attack their assumptions." The tent erupted in skeptical murmurs. Major Richard Stevens, a decorated veteran of the Desert Campaign, leaned back in his chair with an incredulous expression. "You want to engage all 3 simultaneously? That violates every principle of concentrated force we've learned since Napoleon." "Napoleon never had satellite communications, real-time battlefield intelligence, or drone reconnaissance," Rebecca countered. "The principles of warfare evolve with technology, but more importantly, they evolve with understanding of human psychology." She pulled out a tablet, displaying detailed psychological profiles she had developed for each faction leader. Commander Petrov of the Ironhawks was a perfectionist who prided himself on anticipating enemy moves. The coalition's General Marcus Thompson was a former politician who made decisions by committee, always seeking consensus before acting. The Crimson Brigade's leader, Sarah Kim, was a former mining engineer who thought in terms of structural vulnerabilities and pressure points. The room had grown quiet despite itself, drawn in by the analytical precision of her assessment. But General Harrison slammed his fist on the table, scattering the maps. Enough! I've heard enough theoretical nonsense from someone who's never commanded so much as a supply convoy in actual combat. His face had turned red with frustration and embarrassment at being lectured by someone young enough to be his daughter. The other officers nodded in agreement. Colonel Patricia Anderson, who had served under Harrison for 8 years, crossed her arms and fixed Rebecca with a withering stare. General Harrison has commanded successful operations on 3 continents. What exactly qualifies you to redesign military strategy? Rebecca felt the familiar knot in her stomach that had plagued her throughout her career, the constant need to prove herself twice as capable as her male counterparts just to be considered half as qualified. But she had learned to channel that frustration into focus rather than anger. "What qualifies me," she said quietly, "is that I've spent the last 6 months living among the civilians caught between these factions. I've seen what happens to farming families when their crops are seized to feed armies. I've watched children go hungry because supply convoys can't get through contested territory. I've documented the systematic breakdown of infrastructure that keeps 30,000 civilians trapped in an active war zone." She pulled out a series of photographs showing the human cost of the conflict: destroyed schools, overwhelmed hospitals, and refugee camps swelling with displaced families. Traditional military doctrine focuses on defeating enemy forces. I'm proposing we focus on ending enemy resistance by demonstrating that continued fighting serves no one's interests. Major Stevens remained unconvinced. "And you think you can accomplish this miracle by somehow commanding 3 separate armies at once? Even if the logistics were possible, which they aren't, the communication delays alone would be catastrophic." Rebecca had anticipated this objection. For the past 3 months, she had been working with a team of communication specialists to develop a revolutionary command structure. Using a combination of advanced satellite links, artificial intelligence-assisted battlefield management, and a carefully selected network of field commanders, she believed it was possible to maintain real-time coordination across multiple fronts. But explaining the technical details would only fuel their perception of her as an inexperienced theorist. Instead, she decided to focus on the strategic imperative that made such innovation necessary. "The longer this conflict continues, the stronger each faction becomes," she explained. "They're learning to coordinate their attacks, sharing intelligence, even discussing formal alliances against federal forces. If we don't act decisively within the next 30 days, we'll be facing a unified enemy force that could take years to defeat." The implications hung heavy in the air. Everyone in the tent understood the political pressure to resolve the Cascade Valley situation quickly. The media was already criticizing the military's inability to restore order, and public support for the operation was eroding daily. General Harrison looked around the room at his assembled commanders, seeing doubt creeping into expressions that had been confidently dismissive just minutes earlier. But his pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge that this young upstart might have insights he lacked. "The decision has been made," he declared with finality. "We proceed with Operation Thunderstrike at dawn. Colonel Walsh will command the northern assault, Major Stevens takes the southern approach, and I'll personally lead the central offensive." He fixed Rebecca with a cold stare. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez will remain at base camp to coordinate supply lines and communication support." The dismissal was clear and humiliating. After months of preparation and analysis, Rebecca was being relegated to a logistical role while others implemented a strategy she believed was doomed to fail. But as the other officers filed out of the tent, already discussing their traditional battle plans, Rebecca realized this might be exactly the opportunity she needed. Sometimes the best way to prove you can lead is to let others fail first. While General Harrison's forces prepared for their dawn assault, Rebecca Martinez was building something unprecedented in the abandoned mining tunnels beneath Fort Clearwater. The base's communications center had been deemed sufficient for coordinating supply lines, but Rebecca had different plans entirely. Working through the night with a hand-picked team of specialists, she transformed the underground facility into a revolutionary command hub. Technical Sergeant Michael Chen, a communications prodigy who had been wasted on routine maintenance duties, rewired the entire system to handle simultaneous data streams from multiple theaters. "Ma'am, this setup could theoretically coordinate operations across different time zones," he whispered, afraid someone might overhear and report their unauthorized activities. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, a former civilian software engineer who had enlisted after losing her tech job, integrated battlefield management algorithms that could process thousands of variables in real time. Her fingers flew across multiple keyboards as lines of code scrolled across wall-mounted screens. The AI can predict equipment failures, ammunition shortages, and optimal troop movements based on terrain analysis, she explained. It's like giving commanders superhuman situational awareness. But Rebecca's most crucial ally was Captain James Patterson, a disgraced former Special Operations officer who had been court-martialed for disobeying direct orders during a hostage rescue mission. His military career was effectively over, leaving him with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Patterson had spent his exile studying unconventional warfare tactics used by insurgent groups worldwide. "Traditional command structures are hierarchical," Patterson explained as they reviewed tactical positions on a three-dimensional holographic display. "Information flows up, decisions flow down. But insurgents use distributed networks where every node can make independent decisions while maintaining overall coordination." He manipulated the display, showing how small units could operate autonomously while contributing to larger strategic objectives. Rebecca's plan required 3 separate field commanders who could think independently while trusting her overall strategic vision. She couldn't use any of Harrison's chosen officers. They would never accept orders from someone they considered an inexperienced upstart. Instead, she identified 3 individuals who had been overlooked or marginalized by the traditional military hierarchy. First Lieutenant David Kim, a brilliant tactician whose family background had prevented him from advancing, despite exceptional performance reviews. His parents had immigrated from South Korea, and subtle discrimination had limited his opportunities within the old boy network that controlled military promotions. Kim commanded a reconnaissance unit whose soldiers were fiercely loyal to him personally rather than to the command structure. Captain Maria Santos, a decorated combat veteran whose career had stalled after she reported sexual harassment by a superior officer. The military had officially supported her complaint, but unofficially she had been transferred to increasingly peripheral assignments. Santos led an elite rapid response team that had been relegated to base security duties despite their exceptional capabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Major Thomas Wilson, an African-American logistics specialist who had repeatedly demonstrated strategic brilliance but had been passed over for combat commands due to what personnel files euphemistically called personality conflicts with senior leadership. Wilson controlled the base's transportation and supply networks, giving him intimate knowledge of how resources moved across the region. Each of these officers had been damaged by a system that rewarded conformity over competence, but Rebecca saw their marginalization as a strategic advantage. They had no investment in preserving the status quo and no loyalty to commanders who had failed to recognize their abilities. The real breakthrough came when Rebecca realized she didn't need to command 3 armies simultaneously. She needed to create 3 separate conflicts that would force each enemy faction to fight on her terms rather than their own. This required psychological manipulation on a scale never before attempted in military operations. Her intelligence network had identified key weaknesses in each faction's leadership structure. Commander Petrov's Iron Hawks maintained strict discipline, but their rigid hierarchy made them vulnerable to misinformation campaigns. If they could be convinced that one of the other factions was planning a preemptive strike, their perfectionist leader would spend crucial resources defending against a threat that didn't exist. General Thompson's coalition depended on consensus building among militia leaders who were inherently suspicious of each other. By introducing conflicting intelligence reports through different channels, Rebecca could trigger internal debates that would paralyze their decision-making process at critical moments. Sarah Kim's Crimson Brigade was the most dangerous because of their defensive positions in the mining complexes, but their engineering background made them predictable. They would always prioritize protecting their infrastructure over seizing new territory, which meant they could be contained while the other two factions exhausted themselves. The key was timing. Rebecca's three-pronged operation would begin not with military strikes, but with carefully orchestrated information warfare. False radio transmissions, planted documents, and staged reconnaissance missions would create a fog of confusion that would turn each faction's strengths against them. But first, she had to survive General Harrison's inevitable failure. Operation Thunderstrike launched at dawn with textbook precision. 3 columns of federal troops advanced toward their assigned targets while Harrison commanded from a mobile command post positioned safely behind the front lines. For the first 6 hours, everything proceeded according to plan. The northern column under Colonel Walsh engaged Ironhawk's advance units in the foothills, trading artillery fire while maneuvering for advantageous positions. Major Stevens' southern force encountered heavy resistance from Crimson Brigade defensive positions but slowly advanced through the mining settlements. Harrison's central assault pushed deep into coalition territory, capturing 2 small towns with minimal casualties. Military observers back in Washington were impressed by the operation's initial success. Media reports praised the coordinated offensive as evidence of the military's renewed effectiveness. General Harrison's reputation was restored, and promotion recommendations were already being drafted. But Rebecca watched the unfolding disaster with growing alarm. Her underground command center monitored all faction communications, revealing the trap that Harrison's forces were walking into. The 3 enemy groups had spent weeks preparing for exactly this kind of conventional assault, and their apparent retreat was actually a carefully orchestrated withdrawal to prepared defensive positions. By noon, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. Colonel Walsh's northern column found themselves surrounded in a valley with no escape routes as Ironhawk's artillery rained down from concealed positions on the ridgelines. Major Stevens' southern force was taking heavy casualties from improvised explosive devices and sniper fire as they advanced through the mining complexes. Most critically, Harrison's central thrust had pushed so deep into enemy territory that their supply lines were now vulnerable to coalition counterattacks. The communication channels are filled with desperate calls for reinforcement and extraction. Casualty reports flooded in as 3 separate battlefields descended into chaos. General Harrison's confident voice on the radio grew increasingly frantic as he realized his forces were trapped in a carefully prepared killing field. In the underground command center, Rebecca's team watched real-time satellite feeds showing federal troops pinned down across 3 separate locations. Technical Sergeant Chen looked up from his monitoring station with barely concealed panic. "Ma'am, at current casualty rates, we're looking at losing 60% of our effective fighting force within the next 4 hours." Rebecca studied the tactical displays, seeing the patterns that Harrison's conventional thinking had missed. Each enemy faction was responding exactly as their psychological profiles predicted, but they were also revealing exploitable weaknesses that a more flexible approach could capitalize on. Captain Patterson joined her at the main console, his expression grim but determined. "It's time, isn't it? Whatever we're going to do, it has to happen now, before those troops out there get slaughtered." Rebecca nodded, knowing that her next decision would either vindicate her unorthodox theories or end her military career forever. She activated the secure communication channel that connected her to Kim, Santos, and Wilson, the 3 commanders who would help her attempt the impossible. "Gentlemen, this is Operation Phoenix. Authorization code Martinez 77 Alpha. We have 3 armies to save and approximately 3 hours to do it. Are you ready to make history?" Lieutenant Kim's response crackled through the encrypted channel first. "Phoenix Team Alpha standing by. My reconnaissance unit is positioned 12 clicks southeast of the Iron Hawk's main artillery positions. His voice carried none of the deference typically expected when addressing superior officers. This was a conversation between equals united by a common purpose. Captain Santos checked in next from her position near the mining complexes. Phoenix Team Bravo ready for deployment. We've been tracking Crimson Brigade patrol patterns for the past week. I have infiltration routes mapped to their 3 primary command bunkers. Her team had been conducting unauthorized surveillance missions under the guise of routine security patrols, gathering intelligence that would prove crucial in the coming hours. Major Wilson's deep voice rounded out the trio. Phoenix Team Charlie in position. I've got supply convoys staged at strategic points across the valley, plus a few surprises the enemy won't see coming. As the base logistics commander, Wilson had quietly repositioned equipment and personnel over the past month, creating hidden supply caches and mobile command posts that existed entirely outside the official command structure. Rebecca's fingers danced across the holographic interface, pulling up real-time positions of all forces in the valley. The underground command center hummed with activity as her team monitored dozens of data streams simultaneously. Initiating Operation Phoenix in 60 seconds. Remember, we're not just coordinating 3 separate missions, we're conducting psychological warfare designed to turn our enemy's own strategies against them. Technical Sergeant Chen's voice was steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. All communication arrays online, satellite uplink stable, AI battlefield management system shows green across all parameters. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from her command station, multiple screens showing complex algorithmic calculations. Predictive models are running smoothly. The system is already identifying optimal timing windows for each phase of the operation. Her software was processing weather patterns, ammunition supplies, troop fatigue levels, and terrain conditions to provide split-second tactical recommendations. Rebecca activated the first phase of her plan, targeting Commander Petrov's Ironhawks with carefully crafted misinformation. Using captured enemy communication equipment, her team began broadcasting false radio traffic suggesting that the coalition was massing forces for a surprise assault on the Ironhawks' rear positions. The transmissions were deliberately crude, designed to sound like militia fighters trying to maintain radio silence but failing to mask their intentions. Simultaneously, Kim's reconnaissance unit began a series of precisely timed diversionary attacks on Ironhawk's patrol routes, designed to look like coalition reconnaissance probes. Each engagement lasted exactly 3 minutes before Kim's soldiers melted back into the forest, leaving behind evidence that pointed toward a much larger force preparing to attack. The psychological manipulation worked exactly as Rebecca had predicted. Commander Petrov's perfectionist nature made him incapable of ignoring potential threats, even when his rational mind suggested they might be deceptions. Within 30 minutes, Ironhawk's artillery units began repositioning to defend against the Phantom Coalition assault, reducing pressure on Colonel Walsh's trapped northern column. Phase 2 targeted General Thompson's coalition leadership with contradictory intelligence reports designed to trigger their consensus-building paralysis. Wilson's logistics network proved invaluable here, as his supply convoys had legitimate access to coalition territory under pre-war trade agreements. His drivers, many of whom were local civilians with family connections to militia members, began spreading conflicting rumors about federal troop movements and strategic objectives. Some reports suggested the military was preparing to retreat after taking heavy casualties. Others claimed massive reinforcements were en route from Fort Carson. Still others indicated that the federal government was planning to negotiate a settlement that would grant the coalition limited autonomy. Each story contained just enough verifiable details to seem credible, but together they created a picture so contradictory that coalition commanders couldn't agree on how to respond. Santos launched the most dangerous phase of the operation, infiltrating the Crimson Brigade's mining complex defenses with surgical precision. Her team's objective wasn't to inflict casualties, but to create the illusion of a massive tunneling operation designed to collapse the mining infrastructure. They planted seismic charges at precisely calculated intervals, not to cause actual damage, but to create vibration patterns that would suggest extensive underground excavation. Sarah Kim's engineering background made her hypersensitive to any threats to the structural integrity of her defensive positions. When her sensors began detecting unusual seismic activity, she immediately pulled her forces back from forward positions to protect critical infrastructure points. This retreat created gaps in the Crimson Brigade's defensive lines that Major Stevens could exploit to extract his battered southern column. But the most challenging aspect of Operation Phoenix was coordinating the extraction of General Harrison's Central Assault Force, which remained trapped deep in enemy territory with dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. Rebecca realized that conventional rescue operations would only result in more losses. Instead, she needed to create an opportunity for Harrison's forces to extract themselves while maintaining their dignity and combat effectiveness. The solution came from an unexpected source. Captain Patterson, monitoring coalition communications from the underground command center, detected increasing panic among militia commanders as conflicting intelligence reports undermined their confidence in their leadership. General Thompson was calling emergency meetings every 30 minutes, trying to achieve consensus on objectives that changed with each new piece of contradictory information. "They're paralyzed," Patterson reported with barely contained excitement. "Coalition commanders are so busy arguing with each other that they're not coordinating defensive actions. If we can maintain this confusion for another 2 hours, their defensive lines will collapse from internal disagreement rather than external pressure." Rebecca saw the opportunity immediately. She activated an emergency broadcast protocol that sent simultaneous messages to all 3 of her field commanders. "Phoenix teams, initiate Cascade Protocol. We're going to turn this valley into a chessboard where our enemies defeat themselves." Kim's reconnaissance unit began broadcasting false coalition communications, using captured equipment to send orders that contradicted each other and created maximum confusion among militia units. Santos planted evidence suggesting that Crimson Brigade forces were preparing to abandon their mining positions and retreat to the eastern passes. Wilson's logistics network spread rumors that federal forces were receiving advanced weapon systems that would make continued resistance futile. The psychological pressure proved overwhelming. Within 2 hours, all 3 enemy factions were operating under false assumptions about their opponent's capabilities and intentions. Commander Petrov's Iron Hawks had repositioned so many units to defend against phantom threats that their actual combat effectiveness was severely compromised. General Thompson's coalition was consuming more resources on internal meetings and debates than on actual military operations. Sarah Kim's Crimson Brigade had pulled back into such defensive positions that they were effectively besieged within their own fortifications. But Rebecca's masterstroke came when she realized that the 3 enemy factions' mutual suspicions could be weaponized against them. Using her intelligence network, she began feeding each group information suggesting that the other 2 were secretly negotiating separate peace deals with federal forces. The Ironhawks received evidence that the coalition was preparing to surrender in exchange for amnesty. The coalition intercepted communications indicating that the Crimson Brigade was willing to provide intelligence on the other faction's positions. The Crimson Brigade discovered documents suggesting that the Ironhawks were planning to eliminate their former allies once federal pressure decreased. The effect was devastating. Years of uneasy cooperation between the 3 factions evaporated in hours as suspicion and paranoia consumed their leadership. Radio communications filled with accusations and threats as former allies turned on each other. Military coordination collapsed as each group began preparing to defend against attacks from their supposed partners. In the underground command center, Rebecca watched the real-time intelligence feeds with amazement. Her psychological warfare campaign had exceeded even her most optimistic projections. The 3 enemy factions were now more focused on fighting each other than on resisting federal forces. "Ma'am?" Technical Sergeant Chen called out from his monitoring station. "We're receiving extraction requests from all 3 federal positions." Colonel Walsh reports the Iron Hawks have withdrawn most of their artillery to defensive positions. Major Stevens says Crimson Brigade resistance has collapsed along his entire front. And General Harrison, Chen paused, consulting his communications log. General Harrison is requesting immediate extraction for his command unit. He's not specifying reasons, but his radio traffic suggests extreme urgency. Rebecca studied the tactical displays, seeing the complete picture that no conventional commander could have achieved. 3 separate armies were operating independently across a 200-mile front, but they were all responding to her strategic vision. The impossible had become reality. "Begin Phase 4, she announced to her team. "It's time to finish this." Phase 4 of Operation Phoenix required Rebecca to accomplish something that military theorists had declared impossible: convert a chaotic 3-way conflict into a controlled demolition of enemy resistance without firing a single shot. The key was understanding that the Cascade Valley wasn't just a battlefield, it was an ecosystem, where every action created cascading reactions throughout the entire system. Major Wilson's supply network became the catalyst for the operation's most audacious element. His drivers, who had been delivering humanitarian aid to civilian populations throughout the conflict, now carried a different kind of cargo: carefully crafted documents that would convince each faction they had discovered definitive proof of their allies' treachery. The Iron Hawks received shipping manifests showing that coalition forces had been selling captured federal weapons to black market dealers in exchange for advanced communication equipment. Commander Petrov's rigid military mindset couldn't tolerate the idea that his allies were profiteering from war while his soldiers died defending shared territory. The documents were sophisticated forgeries, complete with authentic-looking serial numbers and shipping codes that matched real weapons lost during previous engagements. General Thompson's coalition commanders found detailed financial records suggesting that the Crimson Brigade was secretly negotiating mining rights deals with federal authorities, planning to resume industrial operations as soon as the conflict ended. For militia leaders who had sacrificed their livelihoods to resist federal control, the revelation that their allies were already planning to benefit from surrender was absolutely devastating. Sarah Kim's Crimson Brigade intercepted communications indicating that Iron Hawk's leadership was preparing to relocate their operations to the Eastern Territories, abandoning the valley entirely once they had used their allies to inflict maximum damage on federal forces. The engineering-minded leader couldn't comprehend such strategic irresponsibility and began making preparations to defend her positions against all potential threats. But Rebecca's masterstroke was recognizing that destroying trust between the factions wasn't enough. She needed to provide them with a face-saving alternative to continued fighting. This required not just their fears, but their pride and their practical concerns about survival. Lieutenant Kim's reconnaissance teams began planting evidence of a fictional federal program called Cascade Reconciliation Initiative, purported documents outlining generous terms for faction leaders who voluntarily laid down arms. The terms were designed to appeal to each group's specific motivations: guaranteed positions in a new regional security force for Iron Hawks veterans, local governance autonomy for coalition militias, and exclusive mining operation contracts for Crimson Brigade engineers. The brilliance of this deception was that it offered each faction exactly what they had been fighting for, while creating time pressure that prevented careful verification. The documents indicated that the reconciliation program would only accept applications for 2 weeks and that federal authorities would only negotiate with groups that demonstrated good faith by ceasing hostilities immediately. Captain Santos executed the most dangerous part of this phase, using her team's infiltration capabilities to plant the reconciliation documents in each faction's secure communication centers. Her soldiers, disguised as civilian contractors, accessed heavily guarded facilities during shift changes and equipment maintenance periods. The documents were placed where they would be discovered by intelligence officers rather than delivered directly, ensuring they would be perceived as genuine captured intelligence rather than obvious propaganda. In the underground command center, Rebecca monitored the psychological impact of these revelations through intercepted communications. The three-dimensional holographic display showed faction positions in real time, but more importantly, it tracked the emotional state of each group's leadership through voice stress analysis and behavioral pattern recognition. Commander Petrov's communications showed classic signs of paranoid spiral as he began questioning the loyalty of his own subordinates. His perfectionist nature, when combined with evidence of betrayal by allies, created a psychological state where he could no longer trust his own judgment. Iron Hawk's radio traffic became increasingly erratic as Petrov issued contradictory orders and demanded detailed loyalty oaths from his commanders. General Thompson's reaction was even more dramatic. The consensus-building leader, who had spent months managing the delicate political balance within the coalition, now faced irrefutable evidence that his diplomatic efforts had been meaningless. Coalition communications devolved into bitter recriminations as militia commanders accused each other of secret negotiations and hidden agendas. Sarah Kim's response was the most strategically devastating. Her engineering background made her approach problems systematically, and the evidence of her allies' unreliability forced her to recalculate the entire strategic situation. Crimson Brigade positions began consolidating into defensive clusters as Kim prepared for potential attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Technical Sergeant Chen's monitoring equipment detected the exact moment when the psychological pressure reached critical mass. "Ma'am, we're seeing complete breakdown of interfaction coordination. Iron Hawks have ceased all communication with coalition forces. Coalition commanders are requesting verification of Crimson Brigade positions every 15 minutes. Crimson Brigade has activated full defensive protocols and is treating all external contacts as potential threats." Technical Sergeant Chen's monitoring equipment detected the exact moment when the psychological pressure reached critical mass. "Ma'am, we're seeing complete breakdown of interfaction coordination. Iron Hawks have ceased all communication with coalition forces. Coalition commanders are requesting verification of Crimson Brigade positions every 15 minutes. Crimson Brigade has activated full defensive protocols and is treating all external contacts as potential threats." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's predictive algorithms were processing thousands of variables per second, calculating optimal timing for the final phase of the operation. The mathematical models show a 96% probability of complete faction dissolution within the next 4 hours if current psychological pressure is maintained, but there's a critical window where intervention can channel this collapse toward peaceful resolution rather than chaotic violence. Rebecca realized that the most dangerous moment of the entire operation was approaching. 3 heavily armed factions were simultaneously discovering that their worldview had been built on false assumptions, and their psychological collapse could easily trigger unpredictable violence that would make the original conflict look restrained by comparison. Captain Patterson, monitoring federal communications, provided the crucial intelligence that would determine the operation's ultimate success or failure. General Harrison is requesting immediate evacuation for his command unit. His central column has been completely surrounded, and he's lost contact with both Walsh and Stevens. Federal casualties are approaching 40%, and morale is collapsing. The conventional military operation that had been designed to demonstrate federal authority was instead proving the limitations of traditional tactics against unconventional enemies. Every principle of military doctrine that Harrison represented was being systematically disproven by the chaos surrounding his trapped forces. But Rebecca saw opportunity in Harrison's failure. The general's desperate situation could become the catalyst for a negotiated resolution that would save lives on all sides while demonstrating the effectiveness of her psychological warfare approach. "Initiate contact protocol," she announced to her team. "We're going to offer all parties something they can't refuse, a way out of this mess that lets everyone claim victory." The contact protocol was Rebecca's most audacious gambit yet. Using her secure communications network, she simultaneously contacted the leadership of all 3 factions, not as an enemy commander making demands, but as a neutral intermediary offering solutions to their mutual problems. To Commander Petrov, she offered intelligence about Coalition and Crimson Brigade betrayals, along with evidence that the Cascade Reconciliation Initiative would allow his veterans to maintain their military structure within a new regional security framework. The message was delivered through channels that made it appear to come from sympathetic federal officials who appreciated professional military competence. General Thompson received detailed proof of his allies' secret negotiations, but also documentation showing that the coalition could achieve its political objectives through the reconciliation process without further bloodshed. The communication emphasized that federal authorities recognized the legitimacy of local grievances and were prepared to negotiate genuine autonomy agreements. Sarah Kim was provided with comprehensive evidence of Iron Hawk's and coalition duplicity, but also technical specifications for the reconciliation program's proposed mining operation contracts. The documents showed that Crimson Brigade's engineering expertise was specifically valued by federal authorities planning post-conflict reconstruction. Each message was carefully crafted to confirm the faction leaders' worst suspicions about their former allies, while simultaneously offering a path forward that addressed their core concerns. More importantly, each message created artificial time pressure by suggesting that the reconciliation opportunity would disappear if other factions accepted terms first. The psychological manipulation was working exactly as Rebecca had calculated. Within 2 hours, all 3 faction leaders were prioritizing their own survival and advantage over continued cooperation with increasingly unreliable allies. The Cascade Valley conflict was transforming from a united resistance movement into a competition for the best surrender terms. But the most critical element of Rebecca's strategy was still unfolding. General Harrison's conventional forces, trapped and demoralized, were about to become unwitting participants in the most sophisticated psychological operation in modern military history. General Harrison's voice crackled through the emergency communication channel, stripped of its earlier arrogance and authority. Base Command, this is Harrison Actual. Request immediate tactical assessment and extraction options. My position is compromised. The admission of failure from the man who had dismissed Rebecca's strategic analysis just hours earlier carried a bitter irony that wasn't lost on anyone in the underground command center. Rebecca studied the holographic display showing Harrison's surrounded forces, but she saw something that the trapped general couldn't perceive from his limited perspective. His failure was about to become the keystone of her most ambitious psychological manipulation yet. The 3 enemy factions, already destabilized by mutual suspicion, were now positioned to witness a demonstration of federal mercy that would fundamentally alter their perception of continued resistance. "Sir," Rebecca responded through official channels, knowing that enemy forces were monitoring federal communications. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Martinez. I'm implementing an unconventional extraction protocol that requires your full cooperation and absolute trust in my tactical judgment." Her words were chosen carefully to establish her authority while ensuring that faction leaders would understand that a new federal commander was taking control of the situation. The underground command center had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. Technical Sergeant Chen's communication arrays were simultaneously coordinating with Rebecca's 3 field commanders, while monitoring enemy radio traffic and maintaining contact with Harrison's trapped forces. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's artificial intelligence systems were processing real-time data from satellite surveillance, drone reconnaissance, and intercepted communications to create a constantly updated picture of the entire battlefield. But the most crucial element of Rebecca's final gambit was psychological timing. Each faction leader needed to witness Harrison's extraction in a way that reinforced their growing belief that continued resistance was futile, while surrender through the Cascade Reconciliation Initiative offered genuine advantages. Lieutenant Kim's reconnaissance unit received orders that seemed contradictory to conventional military thinking. Instead of creating diversions to mask Harrison's extraction, they were instructed to ensure that Iron Hawk's observers had clear lines of sight to federal rescue operations. Kim's soldiers positioned themselves where their movements would be visible to enemy scouts, creating the illusion of a much larger force while actually facilitating enemy surveillance of federal activities. Captain Santos's infiltration team was tasked with an even more delicate mission. Her soldiers, still operating within Crimson Brigade territory under their civilian contractor disguises, began planting evidence that federal forces were implementing new rules of engagement designed to minimize civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. The documents they left behind suggested that Washington had replaced aggressive commanders with more diplomatic leadership following heavy criticism of Operation Thunderstrike. Major Wilson's logistics network became the delivery system for the most sophisticated element of Rebecca's psychological operation. His drivers, now carrying supplies for Harrison's extraction, were instructed to allow coalition forces to intercept shipments containing medical supplies, fresh rations, and advanced communication equipment. The intercepted materials would demonstrate federal military capabilities while simultaneously showing restraint and humanitarian concern. The extraction itself was designed as a piece of performance art intended for an audience of enemy commanders. Rebecca coordinated the operation so that each faction would observe different aspects of federal capabilities and intentions, reinforcing the psychological pressure she had been building throughout Operation Phoenix. Commander Petrov's Ironhawks, positioned on the northern ridgelines, watched as Kim's reconnaissance teams established secure communication links with Harrison's trapped forces, using equipment that demonstrated technological superiority the guerrilla fighters couldn't match. The precision and coordination of the federal communications network was designed to convince Petrov that continued resistance would only result in his forces being systematically outmaneuvered by superior resources. General Thompson's coalition militia, observing from concealed positions throughout the Central Valley, witnessed Santos's team establishing medical evacuation procedures that prioritized wounded personnel regardless of their unit affiliation. The demonstration of federal medical capabilities and humanitarian principles was calculated to appeal to coalition leaders who had been motivated by genuine concern for their community's welfare. Sarah Kim's Crimson Brigade, monitoring from their fortified mining positions, observed Wilson's logistics teams deploying engineering equipment that could rapidly construct temporary bridges, clear roadblocks, and establish supply lines across terrain that the brigade had considered impassable. The display of engineering expertise was intended to convince Kim that federal forces possessed construction capabilities that made her defensive fortifications ultimately meaningless. But Rebecca's masterstroke was ensuring that all three factions witnessed the same crucial moment: General Harrison's personal evacuation, under circumstances that demonstrated both federal military power and federal willingness to negotiate rather than simply destroy enemy forces. The evacuation began with a coordinated demonstration of overwhelming force. Kim's reconnaissance units suddenly appeared on multiple ridgelines simultaneously, using advanced optical equipment to designate targeting coordinates for artillery strikes that never came. Santos's infiltration teams emerged from concealed positions throughout the mining complexes, demonstrating that federal forces could penetrate any defensive position at will. Wilson's logistics convoys arrived at strategic points around the valley, unloading equipment and personnel that suggested massive reinforcements were available if needed. The message was unmistakable: federal forces possessed the capability to destroy all three factions simultaneously, but were choosing restraint over annihilation. The psychological impact was devastating for enemy morale, while creating opportunities for face-saving surrender that preserved faction leaders' dignity and their followers' lives. In the underground command center, Rebecca monitored intercepted communications as faction leaders struggled to process what they were witnessing. Commander Petrov's radio traffic showed growing recognition that his military expertise was meaningless against opponents who could coordinate operations at a scale he couldn't match. General Thompson's coalition communications revealed panic as militia commanders realized that their defensive positions had been compromised without their knowledge. Sarah Kim's engineering assessments acknowledged that federal construction capabilities made prolonged siege warfare impossible. Technical Sergeant Chen reported critical intelligence that confirmed Rebecca's psychological warfare was achieving its intended effects. "Ma'am, we're intercepting communications between faction leaders for the first time in 6 hours," They're discussing the Cascade Reconciliation Initiative and trying to determine whether their former allies are already negotiating separate deals. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's predictive algorithms were calculating probability matrices that showed the psychological pressure reaching optimal levels. The mathematical models indicate that faction resistance will collapse within the next 90 minutes if current trends continue. But there's a critical decision point approaching where intervention could channel this collapse toward negotiated surrender rather than chaotic disintegration. Captain Patterson, monitoring the extraction operations progress, provided the tactical update that would determine the operation's ultimate success. Harrison's command unit is secure and ready for transport. All three factions have visual confirmation of our extraction capabilities. Enemy radio traffic suggests they're more impressed by our restraint than they would have been by overwhelming force. Rebecca realized that the most delicate moment of the entire operation was about to unfold. The three faction leaders, isolated from their former allies and facing evidence of federal capabilities they couldn't match, were simultaneously receiving final communications that would determine whether the Cascade Valley conflict ended in negotiation or devastation. The communications were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, delivered through channels that made them appear to originate from sympathetic federal officials rather than from Rebecca's command center. Each message acknowledged the faction leaders' legitimate grievances while emphasizing that the reconciliation program offered genuine solutions that continued fighting could never achieve. Commander Petrov received confirmation that his veterans' military skills were specifically valued by federal authorities planning regional security operations. The message included detailed job descriptions and salary ranges that demonstrated respect for professional military competence while offering financial security that guerrilla warfare could never provide. General Thompson was provided with draft autonomy agreements that granted coalition territories genuine self-governance within a federal framework that respected local traditions and decision-making processes. The documents showed that federal authorities understood the political motivations behind the resistance movement and were prepared to address them through constitutional means rather than military suppression. Sarah Kim received technical specifications for reconstruction contracts that would employ Crimson Brigade engineers in rebuilding the infrastructure damaged during the conflict. The proposals demonstrated that federal authorities recognized the economic concerns that had motivated the mining communities while offering opportunities for legitimate prosperity that continued resistance would only delay. Each message concluded with the same critical information. Other faction leaders were already expressing interest in the reconciliation program, and federal authorities could only guarantee terms for groups that demonstrated good faith by ceasing hostilities within the next 24 hours. The time pressure was artificial but psychologically devastating. Each faction leader, already isolated from former allies and facing evidence of federal capabilities they couldn't match, now had to choose between uncertain continued resistance and guaranteed beneficial surrender terms that might disappear if their enemies acted first. In the underground command center, Rebecca watched real-time intelligence feeds as 30 years of guerrilla warfare collided with the most sophisticated psychological operation in military history. The impossible was becoming inevitable. Commander Petrov's transmission arrived first, cutting through encrypted channels at 0347 hours. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 40 years believing in military solutions, now accepting that warfare had evolved beyond his comprehension. Federal Command, this is Ironhawk's actual. Request immediate conference regarding terms of engagement modification. My forces are prepared to implement tactical withdrawal pending negotiation protocols. Rebecca's underground command center erupted in controlled celebration. Technical Sergeant Chen's monitoring equipment had detected the psychological breaking point they had calculated down to the minute. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's algorithms had predicted Petrov's surrender with 94% accuracy, but seeing the prediction become reality felt like witnessing magic. The Iron Hawk's surrender created a cascade effect that Rebecca had orchestrated but hardly dared hope would unfold so perfectly. Within 90 minutes, General Thompson's coalition forces intercepted Petrov's communication, confirming their worst fears. Their former ally was already negotiating separate terms. The paranoia that Rebecca had carefully cultivated reached critical mass as coalition commanders realized they were being abandoned by their most militarily capable partner. Thompson's surrender message arrived at 05:23, but it was less a surrender than a desperate attempt to secure better terms than his betraying allies. Federal authorities, this is coalition command. We demand immediate inclusion in all reconciliation discussions currently underway with other regional forces. Thompson's surrender message arrived at 05:23, but it was less a surrender than a desperate attempt to secure better terms than his betraying allies. Federal authorities, this is coalition command. We demand immediate inclusion in all reconciliation discussions currently underway with other regional forces. Coalition territories have legitimate grievances that require constitutional protection, not military suppression. Sarah Kim held out until 06:47, her engineering mind calculating options until the mathematical certainty of isolation became undeniable. Her communication was characteristically precise and technical. Federal Command, this is Crimson Brigade leadership, requests detailed technical specifications for proposed reconstruction contracts. We are prepared to discuss transition protocols for mining operations under federal oversight. But Rebecca's greatest challenge wasn't accepting the surrenders. It was managing them in a way that preserved the illusion that each faction was receiving uniquely favorable terms, while preventing them from discovering the extent to which they had been manipulated. The three-way conflict that had seemed impossible to resolve through conventional means was ending not through military victory, but through psychological architecture so sophisticated that the defeated enemies believed they were achieving their original objectives. Lieutenant Kim's reconnaissance teams received new orders that seemed almost anticlimactic after the intensity of Operation Phoenix. Instead of coordinating battlefield maneuvers, they were tasked with establishing secure communication channels between federal negotiators and faction representatives. Kim's soldiers, who had spent months preparing for unconventional warfare, found themselves organizing diplomatic meetings and escorting former enemies to conference tables. Captain Santos's infiltration capabilities were redirected toward intelligence gathering that focused on post-conflict stability rather than tactical advantage. Her teams monitored faction communications to identify potential spoilers who might attempt to restart hostilities, while simultaneously documenting evidence of genuine reconciliation efforts that could be used to build trust between former enemies. Major Wilson's logistics network became the foundation for a reconstruction effort that was designed as much for psychological impact as practical necessity. His convoys began delivering medical supplies, educational materials, and engineering equipment that demonstrated federal commitment to actually improving civilian welfare rather than simply imposing military control. The underground command center that had coordinated the most complex psychological operation in military history was rapidly evolving into a diplomatic coordination hub. Rebecca found herself managing 3 simultaneous negotiation processes, each designed to convince faction leaders they were receiving preferential treatment while actually implementing identical reconciliation frameworks. Commander Petrov's negotiations focused on the military honor and professional respect that his perfectionist nature craved. Federal representatives acknowledged his tactical expertise while offering positions in a new regional security force that would utilize Ironhawk's veterans' combat experience for legitimate peacekeeping operations. The proposed structure preserved military hierarchy and discipline while redirecting their capabilities toward protecting civilian populations rather than threatening them. General Thompson's discussions emphasized political autonomy and democratic governance that addressed the coalition's fundamental concerns about federal overreach. Negotiators presented detailed constitutional frameworks that granted coalition territories genuine self-governance within federal oversight that respected local traditions and decision-making processes. The agreements offered everything Thompson had claimed to be fighting for, but through legal mechanisms rather than armed resistance. Sarah Kim's technical consultations provided the engineering challenges and economic opportunities that appealed to her systematic mindset. Federal representatives presented comprehensive reconstruction contracts that would employ Crimson Brigade engineers in rebuilding infrastructure damaged during the conflict, while simultaneously developing new mining operations that utilized environmentally sustainable extraction methods. But Rebecca's most delicate challenge was preventing the three faction leaders from comparing notes and discovering how comprehensively they had been outmaneuvered. Each negotiation had to proceed independently, with carefully managed information flow that maintained the illusion of unique treatment while actually implementing standardized reconciliation protocols. The breakthrough came when Rebecca realized that the faction leaders' mutual suspicion, which she had carefully cultivated during the conflict, could be maintained during the peace negotiations to prevent them from recognizing their shared circumstances. Each leader remained convinced that their former allies had received inferior terms, creating competitive pressure to finalize agreements quickly before federal authorities reconsidered their generous offers. Technical Sergeant Chen's communication monitoring detected the crucial moment when all three faction leaders simultaneously decided that continued negotiation carried more risk than immediate acceptance of federal terms. "Ma'am, we're intercepting parallel communications from all faction headquarters. They're all instructing their negotiation teams to finalize agreements within the next 12 hours. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's predictive algorithms calculated the probability of successful conflict resolution at 97%. But more importantly, they identified specific implementation challenges that could undermine long-term stability if not addressed immediately. The mathematical models show a high likelihood of successful initial agreements, but there are critical psychological factors that could destabilize the peace process if former allies begin communicating directly." Rebecca realized that her psychological manipulation needed one final element to ensure permanent resolution. The three faction leaders required a face-saving narrative that explained their surrender in terms that preserved their dignity while preventing future coordination between their groups. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Each faction leader received private intelligence suggesting that their decision to negotiate had prevented a massive federal military operation that would have devastated all resistance forces simultaneously. The classified documents indicated that Operation Thunderstrike had been merely the preliminary phase of a much larger campaign designed to demonstrate federal restraint before implementing overwhelming force. Commander Petrov learned that his tactical analysis had been correct about federal military capabilities, but that his decision to negotiate had prevented Ironhawk's forces from facing an assault they couldn't possibly survive. The information allowed him to frame surrender as a strategic victory that preserved his veterans' lives while achieving their security objectives through negotiation rather than futile resistance. General Thompson discovered that coalition intelligence assessments had accurately identified federal political willingness to address local grievances, and that his negotiation initiative had secured constitutional protections that continued fighting would have made impossible. The narrative positioned him as a successful political leader who had achieved his people's objectives through diplomatic skill rather than military defeat. Sarah Kim received technical documentation confirming that Crimson Brigade defensive positions were indeed vulnerable to federal engineering capabilities, but that her decision to negotiate had secured reconstruction contracts that offered greater economic benefits than continued mining operations under siege conditions could provide. Each narrative was completely true while being deliberately incomplete. Federal forces had indeed possessed overwhelming military advantages, political willingness to negotiate, and technical capabilities that made continued resistance futile. But the faction leaders' decisions had been manipulated by psychological pressure rather than driven by independent strategic analysis. In the underground command center, Rebecca watched real-time intelligence feeds as the Cascade Valley conflict officially ended, through signed agreements that formalized surrenders as mutual cooperation frameworks. The impossible had been achieved. 3 separate armies had been defeated without a single shot being fired in the final decisive engagement. General Harrison's voice came through the communication channel one final time, but it carried none of its earlier arrogance. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, this is General Harrison. I'm requesting a full debriefing on Operation Phoenix. The Pentagon wants to understand how you accomplished what conventional military doctrine said was impossible." Rebecca looked around the command center at the team that had made history. Technical Sergeant Chen, whose communication systems had coordinated the most complex operation ever attempted. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose algorithms had predicted human behavior with mathematical precision. Captain Patterson, whose unconventional warfare expertise had provided crucial tactical insights. Lieutenant Pim, Captain Santos, and Major Wilson, whose field operations had executed psychological manipulation so sophisticated that enemy forces had defeated themselves. "Sir," Rebecca replied, "I'll provide a complete operational analysis. But the core principle is simple. Sometimes the most effective way to command 3 armies simultaneously is to let your enemies command them for you." 6 months after the Cascade Valley Resolution, as military historians would later name it, Rebecca Martinez stood before a joint session of Congress delivering testimony that would fundamentally alter American military doctrine. The same chamber that had questioned federal forces' inability to resolve the Valley conflict now listened in stunned silence as she explained how psychological warfare had achieved in days what conventional military operations had failed to accomplish in years. Senator Margaret Williams of California leaned forward in her chair, studying the classified operation reports spread across her desk. "Colonel Martinez, you're telling us that you ended a 3-way insurgency without firing a single shot in the decisive engagement?" The promotion to full colonel had come through 3 months earlier, along with unprecedented access to resources for developing her psychological warfare methodologies. "That's correct, Senator," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had proven the impossible was merely improbable. The transformation in Rebecca's career had been swift and dramatic. The same generals who had dismissed her as an inexperienced theorist now competed to have her assigned to their commands. Military academies worldwide were redesigning their curricula to incorporate psychological warfare principles that had never been formally recognized as legitimate military science. But the most significant changes weren't happening in Washington's corridors. They were unfolding in the Cascade Valley itself, where former enemies were working together on reconstruction projects that served as living proof that conflict resolution could create better outcomes than military victory. Commander Petrov, now Director of Regional Security Operations, supervised integrated teams that included former Ironhawks, coalition militia members, and Crimson Brigade engineers. His perfectionist nature, which had made him vulnerable to psychological manipulation during the conflict, now drove him to create security protocols that protect all Valley residents regardless of their former factional affiliations. The irony wasn't lost on Petrov that his greatest professional achievement had come not from military conquest, but from learning to channel his tactical expertise toward protecting rather than destroying. His security force had become a model for post-conflict integration that Pentagon officials were studying for application in other disputed regions worldwide. General Thompson had transitioned into elected leadership of the Cascade Valley Regional Council, implementing the democratic governance structures that had been promised during the reconciliation negotiations. His political skills, which Rebecca had exploited by feeding him contradictory information during the conflict, now served him well in building consensus among former enemies who remained suspicious of each other's motives. Thompson's council meetings often featured heated debates between representatives of communities that had been shooting at each other just months earlier. But the constitutional framework that federal negotiators had provided gave them legal mechanisms for resolving disputes that made violence both unnecessary and counterproductive. Sarah Kim had become the lead engineer for the Valley Reconstruction Authority, overseeing infrastructure projects that utilized sustainable technologies while creating employment opportunities for workers from all 3 former factions. Her systematic approach to problem-solving, which had made her predictable during the psychological warfare campaign, now enabled her to coordinate complex construction projects that required unprecedented cooperation between former enemies. The mining operations under Kim's supervision were generating revenue that funded schools, hospitals, and transportation systems that served the entire valley population. Former Crimson Brigade fighters worked alongside ex-coalition militia members and veteran Ironhawk soldiers, united by shared economic interests that made their previous conflicts seem like ancient history. But Rebecca's most significant achievement wasn't the specific resolution of the Cascade Valley conflict. It was proving that psychological warfare could be used constructively rather than destructively, creating outcomes that benefited all parties instead of simply imposing the victor's will on the defeated. Technical Sergeant Chen, now promoted to Master Sergeant, had been transferred to the Pentagon's newly created Psychological Operations Research Division. His communication systems, which had coordinated Operation Phoenix, were being adapted for diplomatic applications that could prevent conflicts before they required military intervention. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, elevated to Technical Sergeant, was developing artificial intelligence systems that could predict social instability and recommend intervention strategies that address root causes rather than symptoms. Her algorithms were being tested in regions worldwide where economic inequality and political grievances were creating conditions similar to those that had sparked the Cascade Valley conflict. Captain Patterson had been assigned to train special operations forces in psychological warfare techniques that could destabilize enemy networks without conventional military engagement. His expertise in unconventional tactics was being incorporated into doctrine that emphasized understanding enemy motivations rather than simply overwhelming enemy capabilities. Lieutenant Kim, Captain Santos, and Major Wilson had each received commands that utilized their proven ability to execute complex operations requiring coordination between multiple independent units. Their success in Operation Phoenix had demonstrated that effective leadership wasn't about commanding obedience, but about enabling others to achieve objectives they believed were their own ideas. The underground command center that had made history was being replicated at military installations across the country. But the real innovation wasn't the technology. It was the recognition that modern warfare required understanding psychology, sociology, and economics as much as tactics, logistics, and firepower. Military academies were incorporating new courses on psychological manipulation, information warfare, and conflict resolution that treated enemy forces as human beings with understandable motivations rather than obstacles to be destroyed. The change represented a fundamental shift from military thinking that emphasized defeating opponents to strategic thinking that emphasized achieving objectives. Rebecca's promotion to Brigadier General came with an assignment to head the new Institute for Strategic Psychology, a research facility dedicated to developing nonviolent solutions to international conflicts. Her mandate was to train a new generation of military officers who could think beyond conventional warfare toward innovative approaches that created stability rather than merely imposing order. The Institute's first major project involved analyzing conflicts in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where traditional military interventions had failed to achieve lasting resolutions. Rebecca's teams were developing psychological profiles of faction leaders, economic analyses of underlying grievances, and communication strategies that could channel political frustrations toward constructive rather than destructive outcomes. But the most profound impact of Operation Phoenix wasn't institutional change within the military establishment. It was the recognition that apparently impossible challenges often have solutions that become visible only when conventional assumptions are abandoned in favor of creative problem-solving. The Cascade Valley had become a pilgrimage site for military strategists, political scientists, and conflict resolution specialists from around the world. Universities were sending graduate students to study how former enemies had transitioned from warfare to cooperation in less than a year. International organizations were documenting the reconciliation process as a model for post-conflict reconstruction that could be adapted to other regions. Rebecca often returned to the valley to observe the ongoing transformation and to remind herself that the most important victories weren't achieved through military superiority, but through understanding that apparent enemies often share common interests that conflict prevented them from recognizing. Standing on the observation deck of the new Valley Community Center, built on land that had been contested territory just 18 months earlier, Rebecca watched children from families that had belonged to different factions playing together in integrated schools. Former fighters who had been prepared to kill each other were coaching youth sports teams and organizing cultural festivals that celebrated their shared heritage rather than their historical divisions. The woman who had been mocked for suggesting she could command 3 armies simultaneously had done something far more significant. She had proven that the highest form of military leadership wasn't commanding armies to destroy enemies, but enabling former enemies to build something better together. The congressional testimony concluded with Senator Williams asking the question that would define Rebecca's legacy. General Martinez, what would you say to young officers who believe that conventional military thinking is sufficient for modern challenges? Rebecca's answer would be quoted in military textbooks for generations. I would tell them that the greatest victories aren't won by those who can destroy their enemies most efficiently, but by those who can transform enemies into allies. The future of warfare isn't about commanding armies. It's about commanding respect, understanding, and the courage to try solutions that others dismiss as impossible. The woman they had once mocked for her leadership capacity had revolutionized the very definition of military command. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is the willingness to imagine that war itself might not be the answer. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.